Everybody, my name is Meredith Wallis. I work at Legal Services for Prisoners with Children. My project is called the East Bay Family Defender Project, where I work on preventing people from entering foster care system. We are a support center, so that means for any of you, if you have questions about anything in this for your own clients, please just give me an email or call, and I would be happy to help you. What we're talking about today is race class in the foster care system through the change in decision-making to structured decision-making risk assessments, primarily, meaning actuarial assessments. If that doesn't make sense, hopefully it will by the end, but what we're going to start with is a historical and contextual understanding of child welfare. And then I'm going to talk about the purpose of actuarial assessments, the shift from clinical judgment to actuarial within that history and context, and then talk about how the SDM, specifically the risk assessment, which this will all make sense when we're done, functions in the foster care system. Then we're going to talk about critiques of actuarial assessments through talking about critiques of the SDM, and then the relevance to legal aid attorneys, which I hope will be great, but we'll see. I've provided a couple handouts. Some of them, one of them in particular, I think would be better to reference than the slide I have, which I will refer to, but they are the California Structured Decision-Making Policy and Procedures Manual, which explains how to use all of the risk assessments and safety assessments and why we use them. And then the safety assessment and risk assessment in particular, which are used at 2 decision points in deciding whether or not children enter foster care. And then I included 2 articles. If you become just like really, really interested in risk assessments and actuarial logic as applied to making decisions about collective classes, I really recommend both of these. First is Hirschman and Bosk's Standardizing Biases, and the next is Feely and Bosk's discussion of what this did for reducing racial disproportionality in child welfare. Both of them are excellent and definitely explain everything better than me, so I really recommend them. First, child welfare in the United States. Some of this is going to be old history. Just as a brief note to explain, I was in family defense, meaning a parent's attorney, for 3 years in dependency court and 3 years in prevention. Before that, I was an academic, and one of my specializations was the history of childhood, which is going to become pretty evident to everyone. So oops, just have to move the control button. Sorry, somehow my slides started moving. Okay, so how does the US score on indicators for child welfare? Pretty badly. In fact, the worst of all economically comparable nations. The US child poverty rate hovers between 16 and 22%. That's twice as high as most comparable nations. For example, the UK is 11, Denmark is 2.9. It's higher still for non-white children. For our purposes, we're going to be talking a lot about Black and Native American children, because they are particularly targeted by how the system of child welfare was designed in the United States. So they're almost never below 33% and sometimes as high as 40% in certain jurisdictions. Poverty, if the US government thinks you're poor, I'm sure I don't need to tell this to legal aid attorneys, you are very, very poor. So a family of 4 with earnings below $30,900 in 2023. That means that the poverty line is a sort of arbitrary fixation. So there's also like people above and below, and most people are only one event from dipping below who are hovering above. So 38.4% of families have at least one material hardship. That includes food insecurity, inability to pay essential household bills, inability to access medical care, or substandard or overcrowded housing, or no housing at all. Also things that are worse than comparable countries: the infant mortality rate for the US, the maternal mortality rate, educational attainment and mobility for children in poverty, how much the US spends on children in poverty, which is not much, and the single parent household percentage. Now, this number is often cited in discussions of child maltreatment, that it is correlated with child maltreatment. What is not put in that is the fact that many of the single parent households, and in fact, the US rates, is in part because of the statistic everyone I think knows, which is that we have the highest incarceration rate of any independent democracy, and that each of our states incarcerates more people per capita than most nations. And we also incarcerate more youth than most nations. So how did we get here? Historically, this is going to be a broader, more macro history, and then we'll go more narrowly into the system of foster care itself. Most of this has to do with both discursively and actually removing children from family. What I mean by that is that, and you can see this in the names of all of the child welfare systems, you often have children and family team, children and family services. There's like a fracturing at the level of discourse between children and the people who take care of children. How that came about, for modernity, advanced capitalism, and the women's movement all contribute to the discursive prioritization of child welfare. So as children are no longer workers, as they become economically useless, they become sentimentally priceless. So we have this sort of rise of the idea of children as objects or dependents of sentimental feeling. In the 19th century, what that looked like was orphan removals and relocation. These were mostly Protestants removing Catholic children from the East Coast, putting them on trains to the West Coast and rehoming them with Protestant families. It's also the time for boarding schools for Native children, which was a very explicit government program to end Native American sovereignty. Then in the early 20th century, we get our first real welfare aid, which is the mother's pensions. Notice we have the name mother in there. The ideal mother for the mother's pension was white and widowed, which most policies enacted by the states tried really hard to enforce. We also see a lot of the beginnings of welfare logic that will continue throughout. If mothers got any kind of supplementary income or got some kind of job, they would no longer be getting these pensions. So it keeps them at a certain level of poverty. Again, everybody in legal aid is really familiar with this cycle, but this is the particular cycle that becomes child welfare. Then in the Great Depression, we get aid to dependent children. You see the switch from mothers to children. These had to be suitable homes. The money was supposed to be for the children. There's a lot of apparatus of surveillance begin around here to make sure the money is being used the way and going to deserving poor. Then we have the civil rights movement, where there are huge changes made to the ADC. Now you see sort of the beginning of the modern child welfare system, where what we're going to do is remove the children and then rehabilitate the family. So we're no longer giving in-home money, we're giving out-of-home money. So the money actually follows the child, but now the people being paid are the foster parents. So we have a removal of Black children escalating in response to the civil rights movement, along with sterilization programs. And by the 70s, we get two graphs that I think, one everyone's probably familiar with, which is the sort of hockey puck graph of mass incarceration. At the same time, you have a similar hockey puck graph of mass removals of children. And again, particularly Black and Indigenous children. In the 1990s, aid to dependent children becomes temporary assistance to needy families. Of course, we put the word temporary in there. Following shortly after TANF, you have the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which actually takes money out of what had been allocated to needy families and puts it into foster care. So again, we have splitting children and families and having the money follow the child. A really good historian of childhood, Linda Gordon, whenever you see a hyperlink, it's a citation and you can follow it. If anyone is barred from accessing articles and you are really fascinated, please just email me and I will send them to you. But I believe Professor Gordon's is available. She does a really good job of explaining this on a macro level. Also, Dorothy Roberts' Torn Apart, which is a book, not an article, does a great job of explaining this within child welfare, and also explaining in more detail how we incentivize the separation. Now, it turns out as a policy, you can't ever actually fund just children, no matter how worthy or innocent we believe they are of funding. You have to fund somebody who's taking care of them. So who that person is depends on the policy priorities at the time. Oops. Okay, so Dorothy Roberts, again, you can click there to read a shorter, you don't have time for Torn Apart, to read a shorter article by Dorothy Roberts. I put hers as a block quote because she does a very good job of explaining this. There's a long history of inequitable distribution here. And I'll just read it. The origins of the US child welfare system lie in the forcible separation of enslaved families, the control of emancipated Black children as apprentices to former white enslavers, and removal of Indigenous children as an instrument of tribal genocide. The whole point of the child welfare system has always been to regulate economically and racially marginalized communities. These families are targeted precisely because they are marginalized. Their status makes them vulnerable to state intervention because of the way child maltreatment is defined, to blame them for the harms to children caused by societal inequities. Family policing helps to keep them in their subordinated state by disrupting their relationships and communities. And more broadly, family policing implements an approach to child welfare that buttresses an unequal social structure. What Dorothy Roberts is describing here is the particular situation in the United States, but the history of removals or child removals or family disruption is quite long. And most of our child welfare law, what's contained in the Welfare and Institutions Code for the dependency system, most of that comes or can be traced directly to 18th century poor laws. So we have, in fact, on a larger level, on one level, family law for the poor, which includes not just the dependency system, but all of the structures that legal aid attorneys actually work in, the benefits, how we distribute money, what you have to do to get it, what you have to do to have housing, et cetera. And then we have rich family law, which is family law and probate law. And that's just comfortable or well-to-do. Obviously, you don't have to be rich, but that is done by usually the accrual of case law. So one of these is highly political, which is dependency, and one of them is incremental, which is family law. Note on terminology, you can see that Dorothy Roberts uses the family policing system to describe the entire surveillance apparatus that is child welfare. Obviously, she and many scholars choose not to say child welfare system because it doesn't appear, and we will discuss this, to be improving the welfare of children or helping our poverty rate or helping most children, and certainly not a protection system. I will also use the foster care system because I am referring particularly to the solution of removing children to put them into foster homes in discussing the risk assessment. And I think that that's more clear. Another good article I've linked to down here is Erin Miles Cloud. She does a very good job of doing a concise history. She's a parents attorney from New York. How well does the state parent children? The US spends 10 times more on foster care than on reuniting families. But foster care children, in comparison to the general population, have pretty exponential increases in all of these bad outcomes. I put some specific ones in the citations, but if you click on the last one, which is children in foster care, 42% more likely to die than children not in it. You can go through to a link that includes some of these. There's a lot of things that probably people have heard on. The foster care to prison pipeline, foster care to sexual exploitation. All of those are like pretty robustly statistically correlated. So the answer is not well. The state doesn't do well. Who the state is parenting, it's important, even though we're going to be focusing a lot on Black and Native children. 37.4% of all children will be investigated by CPS, and then more than half of Black children in the US will be investigated as well. That's 28.2%. For white children. The overrepresentation of Black and Native children is at each level of the foster care system. That includes mandated reports or reporting, who gets investigated, where kids go, how long they stay there, how many places they go, and the termination of parental rights. Obviously, the termination of parental rights is the most final decision. In our world, it's called the civil death penalty because there you come to the law now as a stranger to your own child. It's important to understand that Native American and Black children have higher termination of parental rights rates as well, and that these vary by state. How California specifically is doing, Black children make up 5% of the population and 20% of foster care. Let's see if this will show us. You can look up kids' data for your anytime you want to look at your own jurisdiction or county. I think it's really helpful. This is 2016 to 2018. if you look, I think it's just helpful to look at a bar graph to really visualize what's happening. Blue is Black children, yellow is Native children. Obviously where we have larger, I put LA because it's the largest removal and Alameda County because it's my own county. Obviously where you have a substantial Native population, you're going to see like the blue and yellow be closer. So that's our state. Let me move to get out of this. This becomes really important because most of the cases in the child welfare system are there for neglect, which is, I'm going to show you the bar graph for California. So it's usually no less than 2/3. In some counties in California, it's over 90%. What that means is that in the law, neglect means a substantial risk of serious physical harm. So most neglect cases come into the child welfare system without a mark on the actual child, which is what people mean when they say that it's an issue that neglect comes in. Also, neglect is strongly, and we will discuss this, correlated with poverty. So it's obviously important to understand that. I see that, there we go. There's a link down below if you want to look more about the correlation between poverty and neglect. It's a robust correlative, and much of research says that it's partially causative of neglect, which of course means that the solution to neglect is to end poverty. Just because this is an implicit bias, I wanted to make sure that everybody understood the premises we're using for race and racism. I'm talking about race and racism as a structural systemic phenomenon, which isn't reducible to individual psychology. So that means the intersecting historical effects of slavery, genocide, residential segregation, white political power, inequitable education, economic opportunities, and policies and practices designed to restrict access. I'm also making one of the other premises is that colorblind diversity ideology, those two have replaced explicit racism as the primary ideological supports for upholding racial inequality. What that looks like for colorblind is that formal individual equality can't ever solve systemic inequality, even though that's its proposal. And that diversity, which turns race into one of many benign factors rather than a structure to maintain inequality, also can't be doing that. Cannot be solving the issue. There are 4 major decision points in foster care where the county is looking to use a certain decision-making model. One is the first one, which is should the child be removed right now from the parents for their safety? And it's always looking at future harm, not how much harm happened before, but how much might happen. 2 is what level of state intervention is necessary to get the kids safe and keep them safe. So this is basically, we're going to focus most on 2, which is, should we be entering this child into foster care? The third is, if you end up doing court intervention, for example, you open a case, the child is put in foster care, the question then becomes, can the child be returned without future harm? And finally, if the case is closed, or you've returned the child and we're done, can we close the case with the child there, or is removing surveillance going to put the child at risk of future harm? The first assessment model that we'll be talking about is the clinical assessment era. That one way to understand what was going on in the clinical assessment era is, the first was Henry Kempe's battered child syndrome panic. This really shifted the moral panics around what was happening with children from delinquency to child abuse itself. In 1963, the Children's Bureau releases model reporting laws, and then those become federal under the Child Abuse, Neglect, and Reporting Act, which is CANRA, in the 1970s, and it leads to an explosion of cases in the next 2 decades with decreased proportions of substantiation. What decreased portions of substantiation means is that the cases were reported, meaning someone called the hotline or whatever apparatus in that jurisdiction was active. And then substantiation means that it went to the next step. It was investigated. It was found more likely than not. So in 1984, you have more than 9,000 reports, but the substantiation is around 60%. By 1996, we're up to the millions with substantiation around 50%. And in 2019, we have 4.4 million with a substantiation around 16%. So obviously we have a trend of increased reports with mandated reporting and decreased substantiation rates. In clinical decision-making, just to explain it, I think everybody's actually familiar with this, but might not be familiar with the term. Essentially means expert or decision-making. Diagnostic or clinical judgment, meaning you use your practice, your years of experience, or your supervisor's years, knowledge, and critical analysis. You're getting information through qualitative interviews and also using diagnostic tools that are based on previous decisions and outcomes. So clinical judgment still has, of course, a tie to research. I think one thing to keep in mind is that clinical judgment has suffered in some ways through our turn to evidence-based policy. The idea being this is just too amorphous to ever be evidence-based, but people do use diagnostic tools that are based on research, and then it's limited or buttressed by bureaucratic policy. So you might decide that a family is at risk, but not have, for example, enough homes to put the child in, and other kinds of policies have to be put in place. So the context of the paradigm shift from clinical to actuarial, first, it was already happening in criminal, in sentencing and parole. It was happening for a lot of the reasons that it ends up happening in child welfare, namely that people were deciding that there were, extreme racial disparities in mass incarceration, how long people were sentenced, who gets paroled. And the idea was that the individual decision-making was leading to that, which is, as everybody probably already knows, is the idea that implicit or explicit bias is leading to the decision. So in fact, if you make those decision criteria more standardized, they will then be more objective and lead to more fairness in sentencing and parole. Spoiler alert for everybody, that doesn't happen. Just like it's probably not going to happen here, but it's good to know that it started there. The structured decision-making risk assessment was also pioneered in delinquency before dependency. So there's a real strong connection between these two worlds of research. There's also a growing internal critiques of clinical, which are coming out of these studies. Essentially, the studies would be giving a certain amount of cases to several different caseworkers, some significant number of caseworkers, and then seeing if they'll come to the same decision. They were not. There's also the workload. There's just too many reports, and qualitative decision-making is not efficient. And a series of government audits, meaning the state was checking in on child welfare to see how it was doing with all of the money that the state was pouring into it. Of note is the National Incident Study of 1996. That study found that after controlling for socioeconomic status, Black children were less likely to be maltreated than white children, despite disparities in removal. So this was a big issue, right? Because child welfare was already a situation in which people were noticing that Black and Indigenous children were removed at extreme disproportionate rates to their population in society. And then to have this report come out that said, in fact, they were less likely to be maltreated, really was a sort of wake-up call. And again, just like in sentencing and parole, we shifted the blame onto the individual caseworkers to say that essentially it was their own biases that were leading to this. And so we're going to need a different kind of decision-making tool to check that. We also have the concurrent movement of evidence-based practice in medicine and social work, which includes the movement of actuarial assessments to multiple steps in healthcare. Just as an aside, to summarize the critiques of clinical assessment, their reliability, that's if different caseworkers would reach the same conclusion in the same cases. Consistency, which is if individual workers are going to treat like cases the same. Bias, is there some mechanism for controlling racism, classism, and other types of prejudice? The mechanism for that in clinical assessment is supervision. And then efficiency, can information be gathered quickly? And then objectivity, is the decision impartial, as in not to the discretion of the individual? So the solution that we land on is actuarial assessment. What that actually looks like is quantifying the past expert judgment or clinical judgments for future use to make decisions. So what we did well, not me. What they did, the companies contracted to do this, was run statistical regression models on all of these past child welfare decisions for the data set that they could have, and then choose relevant statistically significant correlative factors for future maltreatment. What they meant by future maltreatment was whether families re-entered foster care. So you were going to need first a data set for re-offense, essentially recidivism. This is also, if you remember that I said that parole and sentencing also was sort of pioneering this in delinquency, the obsession really is recidivism. And then those chosen factors are put into a scored test. In all risk assessments for child welfare, those are scored in 2 inventories. One inventory is neglect, one inventory is abuse, and then you weigh the severity of those factors. So some factors count more, meaning how significant they were statistically to future maltreatment. And then individual cases are then scored according to the test. So over a certain number means that you would enter foster care, but it also is for every decision point that you, over a certain number means removal, then a court case, not returning or not closing. And then there's different assessments for each of those periods. The benefits of actuarial assessment, or purported benefits, are that it is a huge limit on individual discretion. The idea for actuarial assessment is not that it replaces clinical judgment, but that it is a check on it. But if you score high on your actuarial assessment, you are not supposed to override it with your clinical judgment. I think the override only goes in one direction for the people who imagined these assessments. Now, some jurisdictions of child welfare, child protection services made their own decisions about this because there's a real lack of explanation for how clinical judgment and actuarial assessment should meet. But in places that are faithful to the actuarial assessment and how it's described in the policy manual, you cannot override it with your judgment. Standardization purported to solve each of the issues that we talked about. Reliability, obviously everyone's going to use this tool the same way. Consistency, all cases are going to have the same information asked and rated. So one big problem with qualitative judgment from the people who are obsessed with quantification is the idea that you might, in a call where you're assessing or an interview where you're assessing, ask different questions to different families based on the way they answer the questions you are doing. So this ensures the same questions get asked. It's race and class blind. There's no question about race and there's no question about class included. Also, it's efficient, it's short and quick, and extraneous information is limited, and purportedly objective. So it's formal, it leaves little room for judgment because most of the questions are yes, no, and it's quantitative rather than qualitative. The SDM is rolled out in the 80s and 90s. The National Council on Crime and Delinquency's Children's Research Center Division, which then gets rebranded in 2019 as Evident Change, designs and pilots the first child welfare risk assessment for Michigan. If anyone's interested, happy to send them this. It actually appears in the Hirschman and Bosk article, so you can pull that up and look. It's substantially similar. And I think looking at the old risk assessment really reveals the way in which we started to choose categories that we thought were less problematic. But the first one is very revealing. In the 2000s, there were a lot of validation studies done on these assessments, and we developed the structured decision-making process for each major decision point. Those 4 decision points that I told you about in foster care, they have their own SDMs along with the hotline, which we will discuss. The validation studies, there were competing quantification modes. Actuarial assessment is not the only way to quantify it's not the only tool for standardizing decisions, but CRC was really committed to actuarial assessment being the winner at the end of this. And so they produced a lot of validation studies to show essentially, 1, that it was better than clinical judgment, and 2, that it was better than the other quantification methods that were present. And then by 2010, it's in 30 states and being sort of peddled internationally. So it becomes, and now it isn't in obviously the vast majority of states, but I believe in the policy manual, it includes which ones it's in. Okay, so talking about the actual foster care system, and this is the part that I think would be the most important to understand for your clients. This is the pre-filing timeline, so pre a court case or pre-charges, and its relationship to these different SDM assessments that are made. The first thing to understand about the system is there's essentially only one way that almost every case comes in, which is a call made to the child abuse hotline. 66% of those calls are from mandated reporters, and the vast majority of calls that make it to the second stage are mandated reporters calls. So that's important to remember. Once someone calls the hotline, there's an SDM tool to score whether or not an in-person response is necessary. And if it's necessary, how quickly should we send someone out, 24 hours or 10 days? There's also differential response options. Those have been experimented with in different jurisdictions. Not everyone has them, but essentially you would provide a referral because it didn't meet the qualifications for a 24 or 10 day, but you still have some kinds of concerns. The next is if you get past the SDM tool there, meaning that essentially there's probable cause to send out an investigator, you're moving to the investigation stage, and an investigative worker will go interview the child, usually parents, and often the reporter themselves. And then their job is to mark the referral itself as substantiated, inconclusive, or unfounded. Substantiated is more likely than not. Inconclusive is that there is some information, but not enough. And unfounded is that there is no evidence of the actual referral. This is a side note, but I put it in because most people don't know it. At this point, in an investigation of abuse or severe neglect, if the investigative worker substantiates the referral, that the person's name and incident is sent directly to the Department of Justice, and they are then listed on the Child Abuse Registry, which for us is called the CACI, Child Abuse Central Index. This process happens, you get listed on the CACI extrajudicially. You don't have to have a court case in dependency or criminal. You don't have a lawyer, and the only way that your clients would know that they're listed in CACI is that 3 pieces of paper are sent to them that indicate that they've been listed and tell them to do a grievance hearing. So I just wanted to note that. Then we'll go back to structured decision-making risk assessment. Then you move to the evaluation, which is the safety assessment and risk assessment. These 2 assessments are provided in full in your handouts, so you can refer to them when we get to the slide for risk assessment. The safety assessment, if it's substantiated or inconclusive, the investigative worker uses an SDM tool for a safety assessment. And there you're supposed to say, are there more than one safety threat and no way to mitigate besides removal? And then if at that point for substantiated referrals, you go to the risk assessment, which is what level of state intervention are we going to have? And finally, that guides your actual outcomes for what kind of intervention is happening. One is that a petition is filed in dependency court. Petitions in dependency court charge the parents with abuse or neglect. It's just important to keep in mind that it functions as a kind of quasi-criminal, quasi-civil system, but the only way to get into it is some kind of charge to the caregiver. So that's parents or legal guardians. And then the next is if there is some way essentially to keep the child in the home without opening, for example, if their risk assessment was low, but you still have concerns, you can offer them an informal supervision plan. What an informal supervision plan is that your case remains open with CPS, and they have the ability and usually the responsibility to visit you once a month to surveil you. Sometimes they make referrals to services. Sometimes they just tell you what they want you to fix. Sometimes you're already in the services and they're just coming by to check on you. It's pretty clear that informal supervision is supervision and not the provision of services. Most services that CPS offers in the state of California, if they are offered, is the removal of the child in the placement in foster care, and then third-party contracts that the agency has to put you into things for your case plan, the same way probation has some, has referrals, but they're not running a drug treatment facility, for example. And the last is a safety plan. If the child can remain in the family, what that usually, without surveillance, what that usually means is that we've relocated an adult or a child. So for example, in intimate partner violence, the agency, if the risk assessment was low, the agency might give an opportunity for the victim of domestic violence to move in with someone else, file a restraining order, and file in family court, and then would drop essentially drop, meaning not open informal or formal case, if that evidence is presented to the agency. The other thing that happens for safety planning in lots of jurisdictions is that children are relocated to the other parent, and the other parent is told to file either, file for full custody, or the child is relocated to a family member. When this is done to avoid court, meaning when this is not voluntary, what we call this is hidden foster care. Essentially, the family members file in probate in a way that replicates foster care, but the parents do not actually have attorneys. And the whole process goes through without, for example, reunification services or due process checks. Okay. So it might be helpful to actually refer to the risk assessment I gave you, because this is kind of a hard slide. I didn't actually know how to get 16 things on here in a good way. This is the SDM risk assessment that Evident Change has made for California. It has 16 factors. And then the first couple are about prior investigations. And we're going to go over the definitions for some of them so that you could really understand what is actually problematic about the system. If you don't understand by just looking at these, which again, I think for lots of legal aid attorneys, this is pretty obvious. The first is prior neglect investigations. And if you remember, the N and A is neglect and abuse because you have two inventories going at the same time. You tally up your neglect score, and you tally up your abuse score, and then whichever is highest is the one you're going for. And that's regardless of why the case came in. So say you get a case in because a child has a burn, family says it's from a curling iron, and you don't score high on the abuse, but you do end up, when you're doing the risk assessment, scoring high on the neglect, you can end up opening a case for a completely new set of issues. Maybe, and the curling iron could just disappear, like not actually a concern anymore. So prior neglect investigations, you can get up to 2 points for neglect, depending on how many investigations, and then 1 for abuse. Prior abuse investigations, the household has a previous or current open CPS case that includes voluntary. So if you remember that we talked about informal supervision, that counts as an open case for purposes of this question. Prior physical injury to a child from abuse or neglect or substantiated physical abuse. And then 5 is current report type. What that actually means is that everybody comes in with a 1, either a 1 for neglect or a 1 for abuse, just by nature of being reported. These first 5 factors, and the fact that some of them are 2 points, what I just want to make clear is that those factors are internal. They are, correlations, but they're internal to CPS, meaning that almost 30% of this is decisions that CPS makes itself. And then those decisions become decisions about your risk that are made by CPS. So there is like a tautology involved in how this is put together that's just apparent on its face. Next are family characteristics, number of children in the household. If there's over 3 in the household, you're going to get a point for neglect and abuse. If the primary caregiver blames the child, we'll talk a little bit more about that one, but it's really only applicable in abuse cases where the caregiver says, this is the child's fault, or the child brought it on themselves, or just sort of negative things about the child that go into this category. The next is the age of the youngest child. So if you have any children under 2, that even if you have like a 14-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a baby, you're going to get a point here. The characteristics of the children in the household, for most ability, this means disabilities. So most disabilities, including mental health, get you 1 point for both neglect and abuse, but physical disabilities and medically fragile just is to neglect. The next is housing unsafe or homeless. And then there's all of these caregiver characteristics. That's what CG is. If you have more than 1 domestic violence episode in the past year, we'll get into what the definition is there. If the caregiver's discipline isn't appropriate, and this one, 13, is particularly difficult. If the caregiver had a history of abuse or neglect as a child, that's either self-reported, that they reported that they were from an abusive or neglectful home when they were a child, or CPS's own records of them in foster care. So when you hear people say that foster care, like poverty, is intergenerational and that it's cyclical, this is a good thing to understand, is that it's literally been put in to the assessment. Next is mental health issues within the past 12 months. And then alcohol and drug use within the past 12 months that interferes with family functioning. I'm going to go over the ones that are, I think, probably the squishiest individually, just so we understand them. And the last one is caregiver arrest history. Now that's primary and secondary caregiver, and not conviction, literally arrest. Although at this point, and we'll talk about this at the end when I talk about tips for you guys, it's important to understand that arrest history is usually given through self-disclosure. Prior neglect and abuse investigations, what's really critical to understand here is that it's investigations without regard to their outcome. So alleged, substantiated, inconclusive, or unfounded. So even if there is no evidence, that investigation is going to go onto your risk assessment. That is, of course, particularly critical if you can prove that the reports to the line are that you are receiving more reports about certain race or ethnicities than you are about others without like a corresponding substantiation rate. Eventually, the accrual of reports is going to exponentially rise your risk. The only qualification there is anything that moves from hotline to investigation. So if you get evaluated out, which is what you call it when you call the hotline and don't go forward, then this will not count to your risk assessment. Housing definition, again, this is housing is physically unsafe. Examples given, and it doesn't say it needs to be a lot of these, it just says examples given: exposed wiring, inoperable heat, roach or rat infestation, and rotting food. And then it's homeless or under eviction notice, but that also includes living in a shelter or living on a short-term basis with relatives or friends. This is all of the explanation given in the manual for what unsafe housing or homeless mean. Domestic violence, again, for those of you who work in intimate partner violence, you're going to see that this is not the SDM definition of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. You do have physical assault or multiple periods of intimidation, threats, or harassment. A lot of the cases that come in involve discord between the parents. So this one can be particularly difficult if the question that is asked are, have you been intimidated by the other person in the couple? Would you call that, do you feel threatened, etc. The next is inappropriate discipline. That's like the one that I think is pretty interesting here is depriving a young child of physical and or social activity for extended periods. Substance use, there are a long list of substance use factors, but I pulled the ones that I thought were most interesting, which are an arrest in the past 2 years for DUI, treatment received currently or in the past, so you can actually qualify here even sober, and health and medical problems resulting from substance use and abuse. So what isn't in the California SDN that has been found statistically significant for risk? Because they took their old cases of disproportionality to run the statistical regression on, they would have found that race and ethnicity, specifically being Black and Native American, would increase your risk of a CPS case and a repeated CPS case. That, of course, is not in there. I'm sure everyone can imagine why. The other one is there are no questions about income. The only thing we have is housing. So poverty or material hardship are not included in the SDM, even though studies have found that it's a reliable prediction of child maltreatment in not just housing, but particularly income loss or cumulative hardship, meaning if you have more than one material hardship, it increases your chances of neglect. And there's no inclusion of buffers. So for all of these things listed above, in statistics, it's not just whether it's statistically significant to a particular factor, but if there are other factors linked to it that reduce the risk. So for example, income loss, cumulative hardship, and housing, if the parents are employed, that is a buffer that should reduce their risk score. And you can see that none of the 16 factors include a buffer or some way to change the number based on statistical links between two concepts. Also supplemental income or perceived social support. All of those have been found to be correlated to a reduction in neglect, even if these other categories apply. So what did the SDM do? It did increase consistency or accuracy by at most 10% over clinical judgment. That, of course, means in its own validation studies, it was more likely for workers to come to the same decision using the risk assessment. That was what consistency and accuracy actually meant. It also reassured a minority of workers, this is from a BOSC article, 1/3 of workers felt extremely positive about the risk assessment and the SDM, seeing it as a critical intervention against subjective decision-making, which also removed the responsibility and terror of making a mistake. These workers reported few, if any, instances where their assessment diverged from the risk assessment. So you see that that's 1/3 of workers. That means 2/3 of workers were not reporting that. In case studies of workers who were applying the risk assessment at the beginning of substituting it for clinical judgment, all of the problems that anyone would probably see with this list of 16 factors, the fact that a lot of them are proxies for poverty or proxies for race, that they're immutable characteristics in some cases, that you can get a fixed score, that you can't. People who were working on the ground with families reported feeling that this was extremely unfair and that they were criminalizing or punishing people for poverty. So the major critiques, some of which I think have been woven through actually discussing the SDM. The first is design, and also the design being racist. So obviously, for those of you who've heard anything or studied algorithms, there's the concept of garbage in, garbage out. The idea is this was in part put in place to fix all of the racist decisions or purportedly racist decisions made by child protective agencies in the past. And so they took all of those racist decisions, essentially made them into a number, and then made new decisions based on those numbers. So this is a really good example of how standardization, you can standardize racism, which is what was done. Consequently, there was no change in the things that it was said that the SDM might help with, which included racial disproportionality, recidivism, and mortality of children. This is Hirschman and BOSC have a really good way of saying it, which is actuarialism transforms risk into immutable characteristics of an individual instead of a potentially mutable characteristic of that individual's social context. In a context of extreme racial inequality, actuarialism identifies and then builds on structural disadvantages that cannot be solved through interventions aimed at decision makers alone. Again, that was reflected in the caseworkers' own statements about discontent with this. Another critique is validity in predicting maltreatment. Obviously, one thing the risk assessment was supposed to be really good at was predicting maltreatment. That's the purpose of it. First, when we went through those definitions, I'm sure everybody could see that there's a lot of room for subjective judgment. So if the issue really were that social workers were implicitly and explicitly biased, we left a lot of room for them to continue to do so in the factors. And the definitions themselves included in the manual are not helping. It's not like an extensive definition. And then there's actual other studies that have been done. For example, there was a North Carolina risk assessment study which found a 70% false positive rate. That means families would score high or very high, but they didn't merit investigation or a case, and they didn't end up having future maltreatment. The validation study by Evident Change itself, conducted in 2013, Evident Change is who has made and sold the SDM. They said also the current risk assessment did not differentiate very well between moderate, high, and very high risk Native American families. More than 50% of Native American families were classified as high or very high. And this is particularly problematic given that outcome rates for high and very high Native Americans did not significantly differ from those moderate risk Native American families. A false positive rate of 50 to 70%, it's pretty bad. I'm not a statistician, so I'm not going to go into that, but I hope everybody sort of is on the same page there. BOSC and Feely in the article that I provided have a really good explanation of why this doesn't seem to matter much in this particular area. The cost of false positives are more difficult to establish, document, and quantify than the costs of false negatives. For those of you, this is particularly true for families who bear the consequences of incorrectly being categorized as high risk, such as placement on the central registry for child maltreatment or child removal, because these costs primarily are externalized to families and communities rather than borne by the system. So another way to say this is one of the things that does the most changes. When I indicated that there are counties that are not specifically following the SDM risk assessment or sometimes allow clinical judgment to override, what the risk assessment does for counties, which I didn't include in its effects, but one of the things that it does for them is provide a lot of cover. Because race and poverty are transmitted into proxies, you can essentially say, I was following this research-based data. This was race blind or class blind. There's no way that I could have known it. I just scored people and then I put them through. So in that way, it gives you a ton of cover for false positives. It's also very difficult to have false positives when the system is charging you with neglect. So if we go back and remember that over 80% of the cases are going to be for neglect, in some places higher than that, what that means is that it's a risk of future harm. It's very hard to prove a false positive for a risk of future harm because you're essentially proving a false positive for a thing that hasn't actually happened. Finally, this is the most statistics we'll get. Numbers aren't value neutral. Standardization is not the same thing as objectivity. People who discussed standardization and all of the things that it's going to lead to really say this, really talk about objectivity, but that's not actually, these are not the same thing. You can standardize any number of things, including racism. Scholars in the area were frustrated that regression results were not published, so there's been independent studies that have found weak or non-significant relationships between some of these factors for risk and the probability of future maltreatment. So we're not getting consistent results on these factors leading to maltreatment. And finally, statistical significance is not the same as consequential. So you could have differences. The statistical significance being set at, for example, 0.05 means that you can also have differences that are small or meaningless or skewed by locality and still be significant because there's a large sample of numbers being taken into account. And this finally, hopefully the most helpful part, so I'll go slowly through it. What can legal aid do? The first thing that everybody should understand, hopefully from the presentation, is every type of legal aid which reduces poverty, which the good news is most do, is actually CPS prevention, especially those of you attending this webinar who are in housing defense. So you are already working in CPS prevention actively. Another thing you could do for particular clients, again, just to make clear that you're always welcome to call me or the social worker that I work with, Ariel Reisman, to discuss particular cases and get technical assistance. We also take cases in prevention, so please feel free to call. But understanding a specific client's vulnerability can really, really be helpful when you're working with families. So you having these 16 risk factors and knowing probably a lot about the clients that you serve, knowing their RA number as it stands right now can be a really important way of counseling them if they are in situations where they come to you and are saying, like, I'm feeling really worried because, you know, I have to go to this intimate partner violence shelter, for example, and it's full of mandated reporters. Obviously, probably most of you understand that anywhere that you go to get assistance when you are somebody who has children is usually full of mandated reporters, and that the things that you disclose to them in order to get the help are often mandated reports. So there's a whole other, I encourage you please to take a discussion or an MCLE about mandated reporting, because that's a very interesting history as well and is very similar to this one. But what's important is that some of these factors are mutable and some of them are mutable through legal aid. For example, housing, people who are providing intimate partner violence, legal aid, doing family law, when substance use or mental health are part of case plans for your clients, you're helping them to make their risk assessment number lower. If there were an opportunity where you felt that it was necessary to talk to somebody about their vulnerability to the CPS system based on their risk, one thing that I found really helpful about actually showing people the risk assessment is that it depersonalizes the situation. Like, it's not about whether they're good or bad parent. It's about whether they have these factors. And of course, because of them a lot of them are immutable or demographic, like the disability, how many children you have, whether you have a child under 2. It really helps to talk about the system without people feeling implicated personally. It's also really good to know your risk. And it's also good to know for your clients that self-disclosure is one of the main ways of getting information for the risk assessment. Risk assessment and safety assessment are performed very quickly and almost always performed just with information from interviews. So I think that's a really important this is why in some places there's been a real push to consider doing some kinds of Miranda warnings for social workers doing investigations, because as in criminal, self-disclosure is where you get into the most trouble. The other thing that I would like you to take away, hopefully, is that a high SDM means that a mandated report could be devastating for reasons that had nothing to do with why the report came in. Also, many mandated reporters believe that CPS is essentially a service for people in poverty that is providing support. But of course, there's very little CPS can provide besides taking your child that can't be provided in the same places they contract with. So first is to know that self-disclosure generates most of the mandated reports. The top mandated reporters are police, medical, and school. And if there's no way to prevent a mandated report, the things that can be done are the same things that first is a safety plan to mitigate the risk that CPS would be upset with. And that's part of why the risk assessment is helpful, because it's showing you some of the risk factors that are going to push a neglect case over. There are tons of risks that we don't include in our worries about child welfare. And the next is if you have a client who's facing the imminent removal of their children, is to really make sure that they have a relative lined up to take custody of the children. In order to keep a child from ever entering foster care, that relative would need to be able to pass a criminal background check without anything coming up. In the long term, most convictions can actually be overcome for placement, but if you're trying to get someone to put forward right away for the agency to place the child, you want to actually say, would this person have anything on their record, either criminal or for the Child Abuse Central Index? Okay, I think we've gone almost to the line. I'm going to stop sharing and see the chat if anyone has any questions. I realize there's 2 minutes.